This is Dana Hall. I'm pinch hitting for Ann Robson, who has another obligation tonight. Ann, as you all know, is the president of AULA. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Rebecca Schneider of Cornell. Rebecca is an associate professor and faculty fellow in the Cornell's Atkinson Center for Sustainable Futures. Love that name, Rebecca. And your topic tonight, stormwater runoff into ditches and handling that, and ditch remediation, and all those kinds of topics are very, very relevant to, well, everyone's watershed, but especially the Wasco Lake watershed. And before I let you do your presentation, I just wanted to mention that Dan Kuhn, who is on tonight, is our current manager of the Wasco Watershed Ditch Remediation Program. And the objective, everybody, as many of you may know, is that we work with the County Soil and Water Conservation District. They secure state grants to remediate ditches, either by hydroseeding, where the terrain is relatively flat, or by lining the steeper parts of ditches with riprap rock so that the exposed soil is not permitted, or it's much harder for it to run off in our heavy rainstorms. But these state grants that Soil and Water secure pay only 75% of the cost. The local highway departments are responsible to pay for the remainder. And that's where AULA's program that Dan Kuhn is kindly agreed to head up. That's where AULA's program comes in. We try to raise private funds to pay for that 25% local match so that the county and town and village highway departments don't see any financial hit from taking care of the ditches. And we're in about the 5th year of that program. So
great.
All right. So without further ado, Dr. Schneider, over to you, please.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Share and make sure you guys can see what I'm seeing. All right. Are you guys seeing like a title cover slide? River plumbing roadside ditches?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Looks
Okay.
good.
Yes.
All right, great. All right. Thanks. I am delighted to be here today. So you guys, as I was telling Dana and Dave, are actually at the kind of front line, cutting edge of what watersheds are doing in New York State with the roadside ditches. I have actually, Peter Rogers had me give a presentation to you a number of years ago, and I know at least twice I've given this. And so it was really very satisfying to hear Dana just say that 4 years ago, you started working with Soil and Water to focus on roadside ditches. So I know you guys are aware and things are happening. And I will probably contact Dan Kuhn later soon to hear just, you know, how many feet of ditch have you been able to work with. So I'm very impressed. What that means, though, is I know some of you have heard this ditch talk before, parts of it, but I asked Ann Robson what she wanted because, you know, it's 30 minutes. And she said, no, give us an overview. So let me move my, all right. So that's what I'm giving you is the overview and kind of like 4 parts to this. What is the watershed framework, which I give with every talk, unless you know, and if there's people in here who haven't heard this before, this is the core piece that I feel like people need to see. And in fact, I had the U.S. Geological Survey director tell me one time, wow, that is like a light bulb going off in my head. And he did, you know, his U.S. Geological Survey. So the first part, again, you may have heard it before, but it's really important. Then I'll give you a short summary of what our research has shown as the key things about ditches and why they're so critical to managing watersheds for pollution and flooding and for droughts. Then I'm going to just give you kind of an overview of, well, what are better ways to manage ditches? And last, I'll tell you kind of about where our current research is, all right, focusing on getting people, private landowners involved. Any one of these pieces, I mean, I teach sustainable water resource management in the spring for 14 weeks, and any one of these topics, I could spend hours, give you whole courses on it. If you decide, gee, you know, we have heard this kind of overview, could you talk just about your research sometime? I'll come back and I'll just say, all right, let's just hone in on the researcher, hone in on the best management practice, whichever part, just because I'm pretty sure you guys have seen a lot of this, okay? But nonetheless, except the last part, just because that's where we're working on right now. Okay, So we want to focus on watershed management. And what do we mean by that? All right. So the deal is that the watershed is like a bowl in the landscape. The hills are the lip of the bowl. And it's really important when you think about water resource management that you only get as much water as the rain that falls in your bowl. Okay. It's a knowable amount. And truly, prior to our ability to kind of see the landscape, people didn't know where the clouds ended. And so that's why water resources were managed based on river edges and like jurisdictional boundaries, like the political boundaries, because I don't know how much water you have, I have, who knows. But now actually we do know. We have a pretty good idea. You know, it's pretty much how much water comes in your bowl. That's all you have. That's what you get to work with. It's finite. And it also tells us something about the quality of the water, because the water comes in to the bowl and it basically does one of two things. All right, it rains. And if the soil is pretty compacted, if it's impervious, when the rain hits it, it runs off pretty quickly downslope, and it ends up in our streams and our lakes and eventually down to the ocean. And that's what we call the runoff piece. But if the soil is really porous, lots of holes in it, and it's usually organic matter, so it's kind of nice and rich and all, when it rains, the water hits the soil surface, it infiltrates, it moves down underground till it hits something like bedrock. And then all those holes fill up with water, and that's groundwater. And that moves laterally, that moves sideways, and it goes down to streams, to the lakes, and eventually to the ocean. It moves much more slowly. So you basically, it rains, and you get one of, this is all particularly in the Northeast, it either goes as runoff or it goes as groundwater. And so it's a balance. I mean, you have X amount come in and it's either going to go as runoff or it's going to go as groundwater. All right. Now, all the Great Plains, and a lot of my time now spent on how do we restore the grasslands of the Great Plains, evaporation and transpiration is the last part of the hydrologic cycle. And that's really important out west where it's hotter and drier. All right. But here it's really those two pieces, that balance. Okay. So the first piece is that runoff piece. So here's a nice photo that kind of neatly shows what a watershed is. And that there's the hills, and you can see the tributaries that have eroded away the tributary network. And the water flows in that tributary network, the stream channel system, and that's a runoff piece. And on the right in that image is looking down, that's what a watershed looks like. The red line is the boundary, the watershed divide, that's the hills. And then the black is the stream channel network, okay? All right. So when it rains, we all know the streams are, you know, the water, if it's raining out, the water level rises in the streams, or if it's snow melting, the water level rises in the streams and then it drops and it's lower down, and that's a normal natural fluctuation. So what you're seeing on the left is if I put a ruler, a staff gauge in the stream and start writing down the height of the depth of the water every day and plot it, I would get a hydrograph. And this graph has the time, the day on the bottom, what's called the x-axis, and it's October 12, 13, 14. So that's 1 week. And on the y-axis is how deep the water is. So not surprisingly, here's the water level at 0.5 feet. It rains, it rises rapidly. That's the runoff, okay? Quickly moving to the stream, all right? And then it stops raining and it starts to recede, but you still have water in the stream, and you have water in the stream for days, sometimes for weeks or months, because that's groundwater. That's the other pathway in the balance in the watershed coming in and feeding the stream. All right, so it's really important. You have both pieces, runoff and groundwater. And that photo on the right just shows the same stream, and that's Taganic Creek. And where the arrow is the same location. You can see, okay, you know, high flow, water spreads out, there's more water flowing in the stream. So on average across the US, what's flowing in the streams of the United States is 54% of all the flow is groundwater across the US. So if you want to have fish and healthy streams, groundwater is really important, okay? All right, so prior to European colonization of the US, much of the Northeast looked like this photo. It was forested, all right? And there was like deep organic soils, very porous, and lots of canopy. So when it rained, the leaves would intercept the water, it would slow it down, it would hit the soil, and it would percolate underground. There's lots of earthworm holes and animal holes. And so the runoff piece was really small because most of the water could infiltrate and go underground. Post-human development, it's exactly the opposite. So we've cleared away the vegetation, right? We compacted the soils, and like next to the stream here, all the vegetation's gone. In our ag landscapes, a lot of the organic matter has washed away. And in the worst case scenarios, we've totally covered the surfaces with parking lots and rooftops and roads. And so if you think about it, the water hits all that, it rushes out of the system as fast as it can. So runoff is the big piece. In some cases, very little goes underground. Okay, so that means we shifted the balance. How we manage our watersheds has totally shifted how much water moves through the landscape and how quickly. And so here's a hydrograph. In this case, it's time on the bottom. It's hours and days and weeks. This is a stream height. And prior to development, when it rained, the water level would rise slowly during the rain event, kind of hold, and then gradually come back down. And it would take a while. And there's still water in the stream here, right? That's groundwater. But post-development, what happens is we race all that water out of the system as quickly as possible during the rain. So actually, the streams are flooding. See how much higher the peak is? That's a flood in the stream, okay? And then it drops rapidly, and over here, all the water, the stream dries out. Because remember, you only have a balance. You don't have so much water coming into the bowl. We just raced it all out of there instead of allowing it to go underground. And so now we have the streams drying out, and our water tables are drying out because the water is so low in the ground that the wells run dry. And that's the bad news and the good news. We did this. We're causing flooding. We're causing streams to dry out just on how we manage the watershed. And we can do better. It's like, oh, okay. So when we talk about climate change and the shift in the pattern of rain and all, that's a huge global issue. We have to totally figure out how we're going to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, cool down the earth, and everybody globally has to work on that. But within watersheds, we can work on this. We can actually reduce that flooding peak. All right. So that's the context. So I worked with a graduate student, Marie Lisboa, several years ago. Her main advisor was Todd Walter at Cornell. And this is just to show you how the watershed is actually affecting. This is Owasco Lake. And she looked at about a dozen little streams that drain into Owasco Lake. And they had watersheds for each of the little streams. And they were basically, she picked ones that had either forest, that means it was predominantly a forested little catchment or small watershed. Blue is agriculture. That means it was predominantly that. And then some of the watersheds were half and half. And then she monitored those streams over the course of a couple years and then figured out, well, how much nutrients are moving into Owasco Lake from those streams. And this is just an example from her thesis work. And if anybody wants to see a copy of it, I'll be happy to get it to you. And this is total phosphorus coming out of the streams, and the gray are the forests, and orange are mixed, and blue are the agriculture. And so what she found is was a strong seasonal influence on how much phosphorus was coming in, but definitely there was a lineage effect. So changing the watershed away from being forested to agriculture definitely resulted in more phosphorus coming off. So for sure, think of them as the bowls, and what we do to the landscape affects the amount of water coming out of the bowl into the lake and the quality of the water coming into the lake. Just so you know, this was 2016, which was a drought year, a really severe drought year. So this particular study, she had almost no runoff in the streams at all for months. And then everything moved like in early October. So she saw this strong seasonal effect because everything just was kind of building up in the watershed, and then it all flushed through. So this is a specific study that allowed us to look at drought and post-drought events. Okay. So that's the framework for thinking about water management and precipitation management and runoff and groundwater in watersheds. And so what we did is we started to say, well, back in 2004, I started saying, well, why are the streams eroding like this? What's going on in these streams? And that was the beginning of this program that has grown and grown because we looked at roadside ditches. So ditches are the depressions on each side of the road. And I have photos from all over the world. And wherever they put a road in, there's usually a dotted line down the middle. It's crowned, which means it's curved. And on each side is a depression. And it's put there to capture the runoff from the road so the road doesn't flood. And also in northern latitudes, it keeps the ground from freezing under the road because the water moves away. And that, I mean, literally the whole world, this is how we make roads, with those ditches. And so we started to ask, they're crisscrossing the whole watershed. What role are they playing in floods and droughts and water pollution? So we've done this work now in about 12 different watersheds in New York, Pennsylvania. We've done some work in Indonesia. And again, we tackle them all about the same, which means the first thing we do in all these studies is you have to map the ditches, all right? We all grow up with them. They're sitting out in front of my house, but most of the time you don't think about where do they go and where do they come from. And so once you map the ditches, and we use Trimble's, and I've had high school students can do it. It's an easy thing to do, but you kind of have to go look. You can't use like LiDAR or remote sensing to figure out where ditches dump the streams, because that's the key point, and how long they are, and then how they're managed. And then what we do is we monitor what flows in the ditches using automated samplers that will work in the middle of the night if a storm starts in the middle of the night. And we can monitor how much water flows in the ditch, how much sediment it collects, dissolved chemicals like nitrogen or phosphorus. Sometimes we monitor what's bouncing on the bottom, which is called bed load, and like microbes like fecal coliforms. And then we pull all this together through models to say, all right, we sampled 20% of the ditches, but what's happening in the other ditches in this whole watershed? All right. Again, these are many grad students working very hard over almost a decade and a half. So what have we found out? On average, the watersheds we look at are about 16 square miles. There's 40 miles of stream, and there's another 30 miles of ditches that are connected to the streams at 94 locations. So that's on average what every watershed we've looked at looks like, all right? And so on the top figure, there's the map of the ditches. And on the bottom, what you're seeing are the ditches and the streams linked together, right? So basically, it's as if the stream itself was increased in its length, because now it has this ditch coming into it, and it increases the length of the ditch, the stream, by 2 to 4-fold. That means the land is very much more connected to water. If something happens on the land, it hits the ditch and it flows straight to the stream. All right, the ditches are put in by the highway guys to capture this runoff coming from the road, but the road's surface area only has 1% of those watersheds. We don't think of, oh, this is a whole watershed covered in roads. It's only 1%. But that's not just what the ditches capture. So if many of the ditches have a hill next to them, and that's what this photo's of, and this is Lansingville Road in Tompkins County. And what you see is this is a hill up here, all right? The brown patch is what drains to this road. Now, without the road there, when it rains, this water would flow from left to right down to this stream, this creek down here, Salmon Creek. And when it rains, all this water would just slowly move down and keep the stream flowing during the runoff and afterwards. Instead, this road and this ditch intercepts all that hill, all right? On average, the ditches are intercepting 22%, almost a quarter of all the runoff in every watershed gets grabbed by a ditch, shunted sideways. And in this case, it's been causing flooding down in this town of Ludlowville. It's causing serious flooding. And so finally, the county said, we have to deal with this. And they put in a basin here to capture it all, and it stopped the flooding. So 22% of all the runoff is being grabbed by the ditches, shunted up down into the streams very quickly. And so this speeds up how quickly the water leaves the landscape. And so the student, Dr. Brian Buchanan, mapped this Payne's Creek that feeds to Cayuga Lake and figured out, using a lot of different models, how quickly water comes across this landscape. And if it's red, it means it moves slowly. Okay, so up in the watershed at the hills, at the top of the hills, it takes hours for the water, sometimes days, for that water to move down without ditches. But then when you add roads, ditches in, that's the one on the right, you'll see a lot of blue and very little red. So now it moves within minutes. So like we have fecal coliform studies I'll show you in a minute. And that means any kind of manure or like fecal coliforms coming from septics, they enter the ditch and they're down in Cayuga Lake within like an hour, all right, very quickly across miles, because ditches and streams are really efficient at moving things. And this is just a photo of a stream, and that's the ditch dumping its load of sediment into the stream. All right, so getting back to that original thing I talked about, flooding in streams, we looked at, well, what roles are the ditches playing in this stream flooding? And this is what you're looking at is here's a stream in blue on the left, here's the road, and here's the ditch. So the student monitored what was moving in the ditch, what was moving into the stream before the ditch entered, and then what happened to the stream right after that. So over here, this is a hydrograph just during a storm. Okay, so 24 hours. This is how much water is flowing in the stream. The blue is the stream itself. The green is the ditch. And when they come together, that stream is now getting a 300% increase in flow just because of, I mean, within, you'll see what it does. So we cause the flood. The ditches are causing the flood. Okay. I'm an ecologist, and this is the reason I got into all this. And we've only got haven't gotten as big a study on this as I want, but when you have that big pulse of water coming in rapidly, it totally alters the stream. So the best example I have is here's a stream, and as you stand on this bridge and look upstream, this is what you see. The stream is 5 feet wide. It's only about a foot deep, 1.5 feet deep. It flows all the time. It's called a headwater stream. I'm on the bridge and I turn around and I look downstream, and now it's 12 feet wide. It's 5 feet deep. This all happened in less than 15 feet because these two ditches that grab tons of water, dump in during storms, and have scoured out that little tiny stream to this extent. So that's what we did. That's what humans have done with this ditch network. We have scoured out the system. Now this entire stream only flows during storms. It's so big in between storms that the little bit of flow, basically it's dried out. Okay, so from a fish's perspective, how this very, inhospitable environment, right? It's no longer that nice flowing stream up here all the time. It's this big thing that dries, and then it's a storm, then it dries, and it's a storm. So it's definitely causing changes to what's called the geomorphology of the stream and to the habitat that the wildlife have experienced. Okay, the next thing we found out is that they are a source of sediment when the ditches are scraped and left exposed. So highway guys work hard to maintain, the roads and the ditches, and they scrape them with backhoes, but they don't always revegetate them. And so the more scraping, the more sediment that moves, and it's a really big load. And so I could give you statistics and all the data we've collected on how much sediment moves in ditches. And they're not just a source, they're a conduit. So as nicely shown in this photo here, when there's a field next to it, right, here's a farm field. It doesn't have cover crops. This is fall. It rained a ton. All the sediment's washing off the field into the ditch. It's going downstream. See that little line of trees there? That's the stream. So now on the right is the photo where that sediment is entering the stream. And you can see, oh my gosh, all the sediment coming off this field is going straight to the stream, causing the pollution in the stream. All right. We did a study looking at fecal coliforms, and we were lucky to get a farmer who would work with us who spread manure. And now, some of this could also be coming from septic systems, but in this case, we looked at a farm that was spreading manure, and this is on the bottom axis is time. So here's July of 2008, and all the way through winter time, and then the spring. These are how many E. coli are in the water in the ditch. And so we collected water samples. Every one of these dots is a water sample from this ditch. He spread manure one time. Immediately, the amount of fecal coliforms rose very high up to, and this is a standard, this red line down here is an EPA standard, super high, 25,000 counts per 100 mils of living E. coli. And then we kept getting E. coli even when it dried. So here's a ditch drying out. We're still getting living E. coli every time it rained. And it gradually declined all the way through winter until he spread one more time again. And immediately it all jumped up. So one spreading of manure, and we're getting high levels of E. coli moving in the ditches very quickly down to our Cayuga Lake. And so when we think about beach closures, ditches are transporting within minutes to hours living fecal coliforms. All right. And so the take-home message, along with causing flooding, is that ditches are contributing to our sediment, and this is Cayuga Lake, and that's a plume where ditches are contributing, and that's the bottom of the lake. And ditches are a key part of sediment and nutrients, fecal coliforms, and to flooding. All right, so what can we do about this? So I loved it when I found this photograph, because it's like, oh my God, this is 100 years old almost. That's how long we've had roads. And look, see the ditches, that little ditch right there. It's like, oh my God, see, we've been doing this for that long. And so how do you change this? How do you change practices? So we started creating fact sheets. We have our general fact sheet, and I work with Cornell Local Roads, who's paid by the federal government to work with highway guys and do education. And they have 600 highway guys come across New York State to Cornell every year for trainings. And then Dr. David Orr knows the name of every single highway superintendent in the whole state. He's just really, really great. And so we have given tons of talks. Recently, we created a fact sheet called Dealing with Downpours, Don't Dig a Deeper Ditch, and I'll tell you about that. So we started, getting information out. We have talked to thousands of highway guys, to local governments, to interested people over the years about ditch management. We have definitely increased awareness. And this is what we're telling them. So the term I use is replumb the watershed, because replumbing, kind of like you're moving your pipes around. And we need to replumb the watersheds because we have inadvertently replumbed them to cause flooding and water pollution. So now we have to change, improve things. All right. And this whole section here, I could spend a whole talk just on this, but it's an overview of what we can do. So best management practices fall into two basic categories: strategies that reduce flooding. So this is the good news. If you disconnect the ditch from the stream when it rains, it won't put the water in the stream and cause flooding. Divert that to an infiltration basin or a constructed wetland or a detention pond like this, and the water will build up in there and then go underground. Or it'll at least slow it down so that as it spills over, it kind of lags before it enters the stream and it doesn't contribute to that big, fast pulse that's a flood event. And what I argue, and again, I teach this and I will go, we need to save the rain for a droughty day. And what I mean is this: around the world, fresh water is incredibly scarce. I argue that it's more important than energy. On a monthly basis, in a year, 4 billion people at any given time have a month with no water. And yet we have fresh water coming out of the sky that's almost drinkable as is, that we throw away. And it's like, wow, if we save that, if we got it back underground, we filled up our aquifer, we could share that water. And I could give you the statistics on that, how much water is really meant. When we have a 10-inch rain event, like on Long Island in one day, that's enough water for about all the world's scarce people who are living in scarce water for like months. That's how much water, and it's drinkable. You don't even have to put it through a water treatment plant. So we need to be thinking about water as this key resource and not get rid of it, but start to store it, get it back underground. And there are ways to do that as well. Then we need strategies to reduce pollution. And the first and foremost one is mow the ditches, stop scraping them. Okay, you scrape them and then that dirt just moves along. Even if we just hydroseed, and that means put seeds, grass seeds down. This is hydroseeding, it's grass seeds plus fertilizer plus a little like a paper pulp. They spray it, and the seeds, the first time it rains, the seeds germinate and grow and put grass in very quickly. It does need to be maintained. I mean, they're little tiny seeds with tiny roots. You got to water them until the grass gets big enough that it can handle. Otherwise, they'll die. You can't just water it once. You got to let it get it established. Okay, the basic design of a ditch should not be V-shaped, all right? And so I have many photos of these V-shaped ditches. They concentrate the flow, and it becomes very fast moving and erosive down the bottom, all right? So that's not what we want. What we want is like a U-shaped, or better yet, a trapezoid-shaped ditch, because then the water spreads out. You can mow that, and that means you can have vegetation in it. The plants hold the soil, it doesn't erode, and they slow down the flow and they filter out contaminants. So we really want a trapezoidal or round shape that can be mowed. We want it shallow and mowable. In the worst case settings, when you have like a V shape, you use something called a bioswale. So a bioswale, basically, you put gravel in the bottom and a tube of some kind that has holes in it, and then you put dirt above it and plants above it. And so under small rain events and mid-sized rain events, the water runs up in the top of the ditch, it's running through grass, and it moves out. But if you have a big event, it percolates down and can go out this tube so that it doesn't fill up and flood the road. So it kind of has two options, all right? So that's, and it takes a little extra work to get to that. You know, it's not, all these things cost money, but that's what a bioswale is. And so you kind of get all the benefits of filtering and reducing flooding and looking like a vegetated system. In some cases where you have steep slopes, putting check dams in can make a real difference because it slows the water down. So I work with Dr. Jim Cunningham up in town of Madison on Skaneateles Lake, and he's the town supervisor, and he got, or let's see, that's probably not his right title, but he got his town to put in several hundred check dams to stop, you know, contaminant sediment moving. They clean out them 4 times a year, and they have every time 4 times a year these 200 check dams called hundreds, even thousands of square yards, cubic yards of dirt that was heading for the lake. And it's like, all right, it works. I mean, it's a strategy. And this is this issue of, so because we're having these really big rain events, the highway guys say, look, we got to do something with it. We'll make the ditch deeper. So there's a lot of problems. One is safety. And you can, this is a post office truck in a ditch they had just dug much deeper. And you know, I'm stopping in the middle of the road thing. I got to get that photographed. So safety issues. They tend to be V-shaped, so they slump. Big chunks of dirt fall down into them, and they're a source of pollution. And then what the real key part is, the deeper you go, more water's coming in as groundwater into the ditch. And what the highway guys don't get is that they actually have more water coming in the ditch that it has to deal with. And the deeper you go, the more of this groundwater you're getting. And so they're magnifying the effect by having a deeper ditch. So we really got to put a bioswale in. We got to stop this trend of let's just dig a deeper ditch. All right. Again, I'm happy to talk about more strategies, and we can get cost estimates. Dr. David Orr is an engineer, and we've put together some information on what's it cost and, you know, per 100 feet to do these different treatments. Why we are right now is this issue of stakeholder engagement, and I'll explain what we're doing with this now. And again, other strategies, happy to talk about it. So in 2014, after talking to highway guys for a long time, we said, let's see what they're thinking and doing out there. And we put a survey out to all the town highway guys, 999 across New York State, and we got a 40% response rate, which is pretty good. 85% of them are elected officials, and that's my stakeholder group right there. That's who I talk to. And let me just say, this middle to old white lady from Cornell University shows up and gives a talk, and they're like, oh yeah, like we're gonna listen to you. But over the years, I've figured out, you know, how to communicate, and they care, and we're increasing understanding and awareness. But when we did our survey, 36% said we scraped the ditch and we do not reseed. 36% of all the highway guys that responded, and they scrape them once every 2 to 4 years. So once every 3 years, they scrape their ditches and do not reseed. Now, what that means is there's 117,000 miles of roads, double that for the amount of ditches approximately, with a third of them, the half of them, being scraped and left, you know, to erode. And so basically, our ditches are in terrible condition, fair to poor. That's what David Orr was willing to say. Yeah, well, they're not really great condition, and they're contributing to water pollution. So we realized we have to talk to other stakeholders. And so I have a graduate student who said, well, Chesapeake Bay. So we talked to Chesapeake Bay. We gave a whole conference. We started putting together recommendations, a report, and they bought in. So the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which includes several, like almost 10 counties in New York State, said, look, we've been trying to stop, improve the water quality in the bay, and we had not even thought about ditches. And they adopted roadside ditch management as a strategy for states and regions to reduce, deal with their total maximum daily load, that is to reduce pollution. So they bought into it. And we thought, well, how well is this going to work? And so Sarah interviewed people and did surveys, and it turns out the structure is not great in terms of the administrative structure, because like New York State, town highway guys manage 70% of the ditches, In Delaware, the state manages 90% of the ditches. And in Virginia, it's the state, but in Maryland, the counties run the ditches. So there's not even a system like, oh, you could stay at the top. Everybody pass the word down. We're going to manage ditches differently. No, in our state, some towns wouldn't even pay attention. So it's not consistent, the guidelines, there's no mandates. So it's like, okay, we really don't have an infrastructure in place to help, improve ditch management. We need to work on that. We just recently, I worked with my grad class and we looked at in between Seneca and Cayuga Lake, this small watershed called, it's a tributary to Cayuga Lake. And we're interested in, well, how many different groups actually are interested in and look at ditches. And so this is the list over here. So at the county level, this is one small watershed, okay? Seneca County Soil and Water, Schuyler County Soil and Water, Tompkins County Soil and Water, Seneca County Highway Department, Tompkins County Highway Department, Schuyler County Highway Department. At the town level, Town of Ulysses, Town of Lodi, Town of Covert, Village of Interlochen, Village of Trumansburg. Then there are a bunch of NGOs like you guys. So there's the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network, the Cayuga Lake Intermunicipal Organization, Finger Lakes Watershed Protection Alliance. All these groups have vested interest in water quality, in roads and ditches. And they're not, I mean, we're trying like with the intermunicipal organization, but it's not well connected, all right? And so the highway guys are kind of functioning over here. People like us who care about water quality are over here. There's the government, local governments who have to deal with taxes and all their problems. And that's just one tiny little watershed. So that's kind of what's, where some of the issues come in is how do you coordinate across all these different groups? Okay, the highway guys, when we talk to them, and why aren't you changing your practices? I've been talking about ditches for 15 years. And they do a ton of work, all right? So they are the ones who fill our potholes and scrape the snow all throughout the winter. And they're putting in lines and putting in, along with all the ditch work. And they have very limited budgets. They have, and so they don't have enough time. They don't have manpower. They have small town budgets and equipment. It's incredibly expensive. And like you can imagine, these plows get worn out and the salt spray affects something. So it costs money. So not surprisingly, resources are one thing. But the other two things they mention are right-of-ways and farmers and tiling, which I won't go into that too much today. I want to talk about this right-of-way issue. So the right-of-ways, because I find it fascinating, is this interesting little piece of the land right next to the road that on town roads is owned by the private landowner. I own this piece in front of my house, but that's where trash gets picked up, electric lines run, and in this case, they're putting a cement pathway in. It's a whole sidewalk. And yet technically this person owns that to the center of the highway, the center of the road. And so we wanted to know, well, wait a minute, what do you think about these ditches? Do you care that they're causing pollutions? It's on your land. So in 2019, we did this survey, a pilot in Tompkins County, and put out to private landowners. We put out 320 surveys and got a 39% return rate and said, what do you know about your right-of-way? And what do you know about your ditch? And how often do you interact with your ditch? And do you know your highway guys? And what we found out is most people have no idea how wide the right-of-way is, don't even know what it is, or, okay. Yet almost, and they 82% go in their ditches. They'll take trash out. Many of them mow, weed whack, some garden. They care about what it looks like. Most don't think about the ditch water at all. But if they thought it was polluting, 78% would reduce fertilizer use to stop pollution. They care. 55% never met the highway guys, but they were glad they were maintaining their ditches. And in Tompkins County, 50% would accept an increase in taxes between 0.5 and 2%, or widening the ditch by several feet to 10 feet if it would help reduce pollution. See, this is, and these are just the graphs of it. So what activities do you do in your ditch? Rarely enter as small. Pick up trash, almost everybody. Mow, weed whack. How often do you interact with your town highway staff? Never, most of them, once every few years. So why this is important is that people elect the highway guys. 85% are elected. The highway guys don't want to change practices because they might get people upset with them because they're the ones who elect them. And yet these people care. Most of our towns, people care about the ditches. They don't want pollution and flooding. And so it's like, oh, here's the key stakeholder group who needs to be gotten involved. So what are we saying? If you have a shallow ditch that's less than 2 feet deep, so ideally ditches should be about 1.5 to 2 feet deep. They will do all the things we need them to do. Then people mow and weed whack the ditch, okay? But keep plants, so keep some grass growing. Pick up any trash, and in particular, the issue of plastics ending up in the ocean. I don't know if you all keep track of this issue of plastics in the ocean. The ditches are a main conduit for plastic. We did a study in Jakarta, Indonesia, and in one watershed, it's called the Ben Solo River. It's actually the second major source of plastics to the entire Pacific Ocean. One watershed, 600 square kilometers, because it's just the amount of, and the ditches are it. The ditches, oh my God. I said, we can stop like the main source of plastic in the Pacific just by controlling ditches in one watershed. Redirect your gutter drains away from the roadside and so runoff from roofs, get it into a rain garden. And tile drains are what are being used to drain farm fields and sometimes people's lawn. And right now the practice is to dump them to the roadside ditch, and that again gets more water in there. If it is bigger than 2 feet deep, we really need to start thinking about reconfiguring it and working with the highway staff and soil and water, because you know, it gets too deep, people won't go in and mow, or they won't even get into it. They feel unsafe. And so now we have to start working with soil and water and highway staff and say, look, I don't want it like this. We got to get this back in control. So for what it's worth, watershed management's been going on for a long time, you know, like probably 50 years or something. And for most of that time, people kept saying, well, you know, we're putting all this money into like groups like you who care. But what difference is it making? And usually success was measured based on satisfaction. People felt good. This study in 2018 came out and I was elated. For the first time, this group of researchers looked at about 2,000 watershed groups and what water quality was in their river systems, and showed that where you had a watershed group and the more active they were, it improved the water quality in the river. The oxygen demand decreased by 2.5% per year, which means the water was healthier, more fish could live there. And that was the first time that we documented people weren't just happier by participating in watershed groups, they were making a difference. So you all are making a difference. I mean, it takes work. I know how you have to be vigilant, and it takes a ton of effort. And a ditch piece is yet another thing you have to put time into. So I'll end with one of the comments from the highway guys during the survey. With the increase in the amount of rainfall per storm, it's hard to manage the amount of water entering the ditches, and that contributes to larger ditches, and we just have more problems. So this is not going away. We really need to be focused on better ditch management and to deal with flooding and water pollution. All right, I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
So Rebecca, this is Dana. I hope others may have questions too, but since I've got the microphone right now, could you go back to your slides and go back just, I think, 3 slides.
Let me share my screen. That one?
Maybe. Okay, so well, you can't see my pointer, but if you are installing tile drains in your lawn or field, direct them away from the ditch. You see that right above the greater?
Yep, I know. Yep.
So a farmer, direct them away from the ditch. Where do I direct my tile drains if not to the ditch?
Okay, great question. So let me stop sharing and we can talk about this for a minute. Hang on a second, right through escape and stop share. One, there we go. Okay. All right. So the deal is, tile drains have always been used and they're very valuable. The farmers put this tube under the ground about 3 feet down, and the water drains to it and then gets out of the field. And that allows farmers to go earlier in the spring so that, you know, they can get their tractor out there because the ground's not as soggy, and it gives them a longer time to grow crops. And so it has some benefits. What it used to be, we actually near Seneca Lake, I think it's Seneca, there's actually a tile museum. because tiles have been used forever, and they used to be clay. Before that, they were stone and just stone lined. Then they put in clay tiles, and I actually have a wooden one that they used to use. But what's happened is it's gotten very easy to put in tile drains, because then it was hard to do, and there would be like one per field at the bottom where the lowest elevation was. But now, actually, I have a whole talk on this, but basically they're putting them in 30 feet apart, and literally you can put in a mile of tile drain in almost a day. So you have a backhoe, you dig this long trench 3 feet deep, unroll the tube it's in, and cover it up. And what happens is, I mean, just draining the soil really quickly, right? They're only 30 feet apart, everything now. And the practice has always been just that the ditch, run the tile drain down to the roadside ditch. But basically, it's just like the ditch itself. You've now increased the amount of tubes going out, sucking water into the ditch. And when it was only one tube, it wasn't that big a deal. But now, and so parts of Iowa have 50% of the entire landscape totally tiled at 30 feet distance. And that's one of the reasons all this nitrate from fertilizers ended up in the Gulf of Mexico and calls what are called the dead zones. All right. Now there's actually talking about we got to rip these tiles out. So the problem is that the tiles come to this ditch, and the ditch goes to the stream to the lake. But that's the practice. So the truth is, if you have the tile drains go to an infiltration basin or a basin on the farm field, all the water, when it rapidly moves out, would end up in this basin and slowly go underground. All right. Now, think about it. Here's this tube. All right. There's the soil, and manure spread on top. Manure is not bad. I mean, it's got nutrients in it. Deer poop, geese poop, everything poops, right? There's a book on that for kids. And normally when fecal material is on the surface, you have the sun breaking down the microbes, heat, cold, freezing, everything breaks it down. And then the nutrients and even the fecal coliforms and all end up in the soil. And soil, actually, the microbes in the soil will kill the fecal coliforms, but there's maybe hundreds of feet to the nearest stream, and move slowly. That's the groundwater piece moving slowly. And so all those nutrients and things all would normally be filtered out. But now I have the surface, and I have a tube here 3 feet below. That means anything on the surface ends up in the tube with every rainfall, right? That's why one of the reasons they say don't spread manure right before rain, because it'll be in that tube and down in the stream. So what do? Right now, it's a legal loophole in the rules for protecting our lakes, because it never used to be a problem. And so there are no rules that say, oh, you can't have tubes 30 feet apart. You can't have tile drains that dump to a ditch. And so Vermont has put out a really excellent report. They did a thorough analysis of all the data, like from the Midwest, and I'm happy to pass that along to you about, well, you know, what's the evidence that it causes pollution and flooding? And it's complicated. Under certain soil conditions, like sandier soils, water still goes underground and less likely to end up in the tube, etc. So it's not always straightforward, but in general, we need to kind of rethink that's like the ditches. Of, you know, there are ways to put a weir at the end of the tubes that before they dump into the ditch. And so when it rains, you kind of stop that tube up, let the water back up in the tube, the tile drain, till the rain stops, and then let it release slowly thereafter, right? I mean, so you don't have all that water racing and causing the flooding. So one, there's no real guidance on this. There's definitely incentive, the market system, the guys who put in tile drains, who sell them, they want you to put in tile drains, and they usually say start at 90 feet apart, but you can put them at 30 feet apart. So it's kind of this messy piece out there, kind of like digging ditches too deep. At least if we could just have some kind of system where the tile drains stay on site, have some kind of control along the edge, don't have them go, like if you have grasses growing along the edge of a ditch and you don't have the tile drain dump, could connect to a different pipe. So we're trying to come up with strategies. It's tough. I mean, I want farmers. I want a landscape of farming, right? It's beautiful. It's part of what we love around here. But so I'm happy to send you this report about what we know about tile drains. I don't, you know, we need to work with ag and markets, and we need to work with soil and water, because they help sometimes put the tile drains in and plan them. And highway guys, so showed you one of the things they commented on the survey was the tile drains were one of the third barriers. So Farmers don't tell highway guys, oh, we're putting in all these tile drains, and it can happen in a day. Just the highway guy suddenly has all this flooding downstream, and they go, well, where'd all this come from? Now I suddenly have a ditch that's causing flooding, and they backtrack and find out, oh, all these new tile drain tubes. So the highway guys, it's a problem. So, I mean, we need better communication. We need to think alternative strategies for doing the tiling. Once they're in, it's tough. I mean, nobody's marking where they are. The rule in Vermont is you can't spread manure over top of the tile drain. That means they have to mark where they are. That way that manure doesn't go straight down to the tube. So there is no simple solution. I don't have a golden bullet for the silver bullet for this one yet. It's just part of the problem as as we document this, it's definitely a piece of the puzzle. So Dana, I don't know if that answered your question or just opened up more questions, but I'm happy to get that report to you too. If one of you emails me, and I'll just attach it.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca.
Dana, Keith Batman has his hand raised.
Hey, Keith, go ahead. I don't see you on the screen here, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Dana. So, yeah, I would love to see that report. So if that's sent to whomever it goes to, David or Dana, whomever, please share with us all.
Yep.
But my question gets at we've heard the presentations, at least I've heard a couple of different times, a presentation by, I think, one of your colleagues,
Okay.
although I may, it's a he, and
Okay.
he may be from somewhere else, but I was thinking he was Cornell, and he's done research and that indicates, in his presentation anyway, that indicates that tiles actually reduce phosphorus, transmission from the field to the ditch to the lake, compared with no ditching. Now
With
that's
no tiles or no ditching? With no tiles, it
no
reduces-
tiles. Yeah, sorry.
Uh-huh.
I use the I'm in Scipio, and so we talk about tiles as ditches. Forgive me. So it is confusing, but his research, so he's presented to us, suggests that a properly tiled field will move less phosphorus and other nutrients to the lake than a non-tiled field.
Okay.
And I've got that right? Other people, because I know that some of these have been in the aula. Some of the at least one presentation I heard was in an aula meeting.
Okay.
Yes, Keith. Yes, this is Dana. I've heard that same thing, and I struggle to believe it, I guess, or accept it.
Yeah, I could never understand it, but I'm a believer in science. So if someone comes to me and they have the data and they say, and they're a legitimate scientist, and then I have to take that seriously. So how do you,
All right.
what's the truth here?
Okay.
Thank you.
So what I expect, let me think. Again, that report I'm going to send you, it's actually a literature review of all the studies that have been done. And it also comes to the conclusion that in some situations, the tiles help reduce nutrient pollution. In other cases, they don't. And it comes down to, if I remember right, the soil type. So what I think would be happening is phosphorus tends to stick to sediment, little mineral grains really quickly, all right? Whereas nitrogen, like nitrogen fertilizer, tends to dissolve, okay? That means phosphorus moves as sediment erosion, and nitrogen can move through the sediment into the tile and out. So if you drain your soil quickly, it's less likely, this is my interpretation, you would less likely have runoff across the field, right? Because the water doesn't pool up and run off, it's going underground in the tube. And so the sediment does not move as easily. You've dried out the field more, so the water just keeps going down to the tube. We've studied some tile work and nitrate, we get incredible quantities of nitrate coming out of the tiles into the ditches. I mean, phenomenal quantities, but in freshwater systems, we tend to focus on phosphorus because it's the limiting thing. And we did not look at phosphorus in the studies that we did. So I imagine that in certain conditions, if you can reduce runoff from the field during rain events because it drains more quickly, the sediment's not washing off, because, if you imagine like that photo I showed you, the water's running off the top of the field, it's carrying sediment and there's phosphorus attached to it. But you can reduce phosphorus runoff through the tile drains. Now, the soil type makes a difference. And I don't remember, I have to go reread this report because again, I haven't studied it. Where it really, if like you have more clay soil, it probably is the inverse of what you see with a sandy soil, just because clay soils will have more runoff. I expect, I don't know which individual you're referring to. We are the agricultural life sciences college, so we have tons of people doing a ton of stuff on ag. So I don't know which one presented that. I'm always, well, let's see what were the conditions in which you studied that, and does that apply everywhere, or is that only for certain situations? And I don't know. So I could see a set of conditions in which tile drains could help reduce phosphorus bound to sediment from running off. Okay.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That makes, I totally understand that. It makes perfect sense. And the next time I see this presentation, or if the next time I see this study, I'll pay more attention to the soil type issue, because I suspect that is exactly the issue, and also slope and those kinds of yeah, that just makes perfect sense. Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Julie Lockhart's got her hand up.
Julie, go ahead, please.
Yes, hi. I have two questions, Dr. Schneider. When I think about our ditch project that we've been involved with for 5 years, with trying to do matching funds to help the Soil and Water Conservation District do their work, the one fact I keep in my mind is that from you, I've learned in the past that we estimate 20% of the pollution that gets into the lake in our watershed comes through the ditches. And if we share that information, is there a simple way to describe how you came up with that number?
Okay, so first of all, it's 20% of runoff, okay? And that's not pollution, that's just water running off the system. And that's important because, you could we can come up with a scenario where there's this one activity, whatever it is, fertilizer in somebody's yard, and they just love using fertilizer tons, but they're not connected, that may be a ton of pollution, but it's not 20% for the whole watershed, whereas in general. Now, what you're asking is there a way to explain that, or what do you need to know? Tell me again how we came up with it.
I think of AWLA, one of our main roles is to try to connect the general citizen person with the professionals like you. Yep. And try to explain.
Okay, I got it.
Accurately.
All right, so here's what it is. All we do is, if you look down, Google Earth, actually you could do what we now do, you can do it in Google Earth Pro, because if you look down on your bowl, your watershed through Google Earth, right? And you have a ditch here and you look at the topography, like, well, how much hill is draining to that ditch, right? And so you could actually draw the lip of the bowl, and you can do this in Google Earth Pro because they'll let you do elevational gradients you draw a transect in Google Earth and then go to properties, and it'll actually show you the elevational gradient along the transect. So literally you could find the lip of the bowl for your entire watershed, all these. And what happens is when you say, here's a ditch and here's how much is draining to that ditch, that's a surface area, right? So it's, 200 square meters or 200 square yards, whatever. Now I do the next ditch and the next, and I add them up. So this ditch is getting all the runoff from that hill, and I know how big that hill is. When we do that, that averages to about 22% of the surface area of the watershed. Does that make sense? And you
Perfect sense.
You can have youth groups do that. It's a neat little project, right? Take one ditch, figure out how much water it's capturing. What's the hill? How big is that hill that all draining down into that ditch?
Well, thank you. We're also trying to find ways to bring information to classrooms, and it would be really fun to work with some high school kids on something like that. The second question, I always like to say, well, how do we know it's working? So Dana, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the funds we've provided, we've helped the Cayuga County Soil and Conservation District reseed or riprap 11 miles of ditches.
Oh, wow. Are you kidding?
Yeah. If you put all the segments together, Dr. Schneider, it adds up to 11 miles or 14 miles of pretty relatively large number.
It was still my heart. Oh my God. I'm writing this down. It makes a difference. All these years of talking. That's fantastic. Okay. And then, so what is your question though?
My question is,
wait just a second though, Julie. Dan,
okay.
Dan, do you have a better handle on the right figures?
No, I don't. I'm just learning all this stuff, but my understanding is that this year there were no requests from Aula or to Aula from the highway superintendents in our watershed for equal, the funding for reseeding, for hydro seeding.
Yep, that's because we had a breakdown in our communication, staying in touch with the highway superintendents. As you know, we lost a key person, and we need to, as you are now, reach back out, rebuild the bridges to the highway superintendents and tell them about the funding that's available and so forth. So
We have a meeting a week from today, Thursday morning, with the Highway Superintendents Association for the county. So I hope to share a lot of this information with them and encourage their applying for funds and hydro seeding.
Yep. So Julie, back to you. My understanding from Rick Nelson is that in a total number ditches that have been protected, is putting all the pieces together adds up between 11 and 15 miles. So back to you. You had another question, I think.
Yes, Rebecca, when you smiled so broadly, I was like, is that like not enough, or is that good?
No,
or bad?
it's great. It's freaking great. I mean, I've been
Yeah.
for decades talking and seeing nothing. It's like, oh my God, you're out there reseeding. Okay, I have to say a little caveat here. All right, let's
Okay, so my second question was, again, trying to communicate this to everybody else in an accurate way. How do we know it works? What can we say to say, yes, seeding this ditch was good because it did such and such?
Okay, let's focus on the reseeding piece. All right. So reseeding means you got grass and vegetation growing. And let me just show you that slide. And we haven't done as much with this as I wish we had, but right, PowerPoint, hang on. Wrong. Okay, wait a minute. Are you looking at the PowerPoint right now?
No.
Okay, hang on a sec. That's not good. I want screen one. PowerPoint up. Share screen. Okay, now you are, right?
Nope, not quite. Nope.
Nope,
Not seeing it.
not seeing it. What happened? Screen two, screen one. Share screen one, share.
Oh, now we are.
There you go.
Okay, now you can see my talk.
Yep.
Okay. Look at
Well,
this slide.
now we see the Cornell logo.
Okay, that's fine. I got that. All right, here we go. Got it. All right, so you're asking for these data. So in this one study, we looked at how much of the bottom of the ditch had vegetation growing. So percent exposed bottom substrate, 0%. That means it's totally vegetated. 20, 40, 60, 80, 100%. That means 100%. That's that scrape ditch right over there. This is the total suspended sediment concentration. So that means how much was the maximum amount of sediment we caught moving through the ditch. And what you're seeing is no sediments moving down here when it's all vegetated. And then as it gets more and more exposed, we're getting more and more sediment moving. All right. That's what you're asking. That's the data. Now we haven't done this over and over and over again to say, okay, this is 10 feet and this is under these conditions. But basically it's saying if it's vegetated, it captures sediment. It reduces the amount of sediment being eroded, and the vegetation captures and filters out sediment. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Now I got to put a caveat because you guys said something. No, wait, stop sharing screen. Hang on. How did that happen? Okay, there it is. All right, so putting rocks, riprap in the bottom of the ditches was something you mentioned. And I know highway guys are starting to do more because I saw this ditch that they dug 5.5 feet deep. It used to be fine. This is the state. So then they've decided to fill it with rocks that are each about 2 feet. And it's like, oh my God, you're filling it back out with rocks. I only know of one or two studies, and it was actually engineers were talking to me and said one of the problems using rocks is that in the summer they build up a lot. They're a thermal reservoir. They collect a ton of heat, okay, and hold it. When it rains, the water washes through the rocks and takes the heat into the streams. Now that's a problem if you have like a trout stream and every time it rains you get this big heat blast coming in or hot water. Trouts like it cold, okay? So and depending on the configuration of the ditch and all, water can erode under the rocks. It's not, now I haven't studied this. These are observations to think about. The bioswale's a different strategy because now you basically have dirt and grass and water runs through the grass, and only when you have big rain events does it go back down through the tube. And then the rocks, once they fill up with dirt, trees start growing in them. It's hard to maintain. They can't mow it. They suddenly have to, I don't know what they do. So I haven't studied this. I don't really, that's anecdotal. I do know, I've seen this where, oh, now you're trying to fill heavy, deep ditches with lots of rocks.
Well, Rebecca, the reason we've been advocating that, and everything you just said makes good sense, good countersense. But parts of our ditches, everybody's ditches have steep sides and or a steep bottom that hydroseeding we can't get grass to grow. So
Right.
An alternative is to armor that.
Right. Well, you know what? Let me know. I'll be interested to see what, how well they work. Again, I haven't studied that piece of this. I'm really, I'm just me and my students, and, we've done a lot to get people aware of it, but there's all these dimensions to it that we still haven't gotten. I mean, I really need to get back in the stream and do that. So that particular strategy, I don't know, maybe it is a good strategy. I just had an engineer in the audience say, do you know what it's doing with the heat? And it's like, oh, no, I didn't. So I don't know. It might be a good strategy. I'm just letting you know.
Well, we now, if you and your students want to undertake some studies, we now have collectively several miles, I would guess, but long segments of rip wrap or armored steep ditches that whether or not we should, we now do.
Right. And in steep ones, it might be a good solution. Otherwise, so the check dams do the same thing. It slows the velocity down. Honestly, it wouldn't be hard. There are these little temperature tidbits that are just awesome. They're $200 and you put them in and they just continuously record temperature all the time. You could put them in above and below and do a very easy study with undergrads at one of the community colleges. It wouldn't take much to start to try and document, is this real? Is it really, moving the hot water along? So for what it's worth, it's not a hard thing to evaluate. But it's just one more piece of this, our watershed management. And I'm just letting you know, just so you're aware, I don't know good or bad. I'm just, here's a fact. Okay.
Well, so if you and your students need yet more case studies, we've got some waiting for you to study.
Thank you. And honestly, I'll keep it in mind because some undergrads look for things to do in the summer and they wouldn't have hands-on experiences. And if any of you are teachers, this would be a not hard one to do, and just, so I'll put it in my hopper of, oh, okay, here's a place where they could go and monitor that over the course of the summer, and it wouldn't take much.
I'd like to share the ravine that runs next to our house on East Lake Road became very, very eroded at a certain time a few years ago, badly, from some deep rains. So they put riprap down and they put a lot of rocks in. Now, what I found to be true, just by anecdotal, just by watching, is that it did stop the erosion. I mean, we've fallen into the ravine. We actually had part of a ditch that went in and a tree that went in. All of that has stopped.
Great.
But I still do notice that during heavy rain events, that there still is a lot of silt that's going through, and it's probably under the rocks. And so I find that while it did take care of one problem, I'm not certain that it took care of the other problem.
Thanks, Linda. I mean, this is how we start to build our understanding, because I know you're living there, you see it, you go, wait a minute, and it's useful. Those are the little bits and pieces I start putting together the puzzle to try and figure it out. Thanks.
Well, also, I'm so appreciative of everything that you've shared with us, since the fact that this is some project that we are working on is supporting the towns with ditch remediation. And the fact that we do have people who are going to go and speak to all the highway superintendents, and it feels like you've armed them with some very interesting information, some graphs and some different things.
Look, I'll give you these PowerPoints. I mean, you can use these PowerPoints, and you know, the fact sheets, we're happy to. And Peter Rogers actually asked me for some when I was going out of town, and Peter, they came back in the mail to Cornell, and I haven't, like, oh, these never made it to this address. Wilbert wrote, no, something. So actually, I need another address from you. The stack that was mailed to you never got to you. They're sitting in the envelopes, you know, returned to sender. So I apologize. When I got back from being out of town, it's like, oh, this didn't happen. So another address, and I'll get you those fact sheets. I'm very sorry about that.
Rebecca, is Adele still in your office?
No, she was my summer intern, and she
Oh,
isn't.
she's
but
gone now. Okay.
Yeah, but she's the one who, whatever. I have your email address, and I'll email you and give me, and I'll show you the address that she worked with. But
Okay.
yeah,
Thank you.
I tried.
Okay, everybody, it's a little past 8:15, and for me and for some of us, at least, it's a very interesting, very useful conversation. But are there other questions? I don't want to keep Dr. Schneider. Well, we've used up a chunk of her evening as it is.
It was worth it. 11 to 14 miles. You're making headway.
Okay, Carl Weber.
Carl Weber's got a question, Dana.
Go ahead, Carl, please.
Hi, Dr. Schneider. This is Carl Weber. Just wanted to share with you a personal experience that I had. I worked with Aula about half a dozen years ago on rip-wrapping our fire lane. Probably it's about 0.2 of a mile long. And of course, it runs directly down into Owasco Lake. Now, this ditch that we were trying to correct or improve was probably on average about 4 feet deep and about 4 foot wide, a typical V shape like you've described. So I just wanted to share with you what I've observed over the past 6 years. So the first contractor we had that did phase one, he installed riprap in there, and riprap, you know, the size of a softball, even a little bit larger than that, up to maybe the size of a small pumpkin. And when he installed this stuff, I told the contractor, I said, I'm going to tell you right now, I says that riprap is going to move. And no, it'll lock in. Yeah. Well, the first big event that we had, that riprap moved, and it moved a lot. I was really afraid it was going to end up on my beach, but it didn't. It got hung up. But the second contractor that came in and did phase two, I believe he was a little more knowledgeable. He used that riprap too, but what he did was he installed periodically these check dams using very large pieces of limestone, big. Now, I don't know if there's a formula based on the grade, how often these check dams should be, but I think actually I want to put some more in. But what's happened is where he installed those check dams, that has really worked to, first of all, slow the sediment and also the smaller riprap that was moving. So what it did over time, in those areas where those check dams were, it's actually shallowed that ditch out from 4 feet to 2 feet, and it's changed the shape of it from the V shape to the trapezoid that you are recommending. It's worked great. So what's happened, if you look at a cross-sectional view of the ditch now, it's kind of like stepped where those check dams were. It's worked great. And like I said, I think it really needs a little bit more, a few more, check dams put in there. And there's another portion, probably another 1/10 of a mile I'd like to get done if I can convince my neighbors into investing some more money into it. But it has worked, but the check dams have made a big difference.
Thanks a ton. I get it. I'm hearing you loud and clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's good to know.
Okay, floor is open again. Any other questions? Well, then, Dr. Schneider, thank you again. As always, a very interesting talk, a good reminder. We do need to come back to you, I think, and catch up on your various latest research as you offered to do for us. But thank you very much for your time and your preparation.
Yep. All right, I just saw there's a quick question from Keith Batman about the right of way, so I'll answer it real quickly since I probably wouldn't be able to connect with him. He says, I thought the municipality owned the right of way, not the landowner. So this is apparently one of the most contentious and ambiguous aspects of property law there is. I've talked to property assessors and lawyers. It's extremely varied. It depends on the deed. So on town roads, technically private landowners own to the center of the road, but the width of the right of way on the property is what's variable, and it can be in the deed. And like in our house, it's from 1800, so it's in the deed. It can be out of practice. So if highway guys have been working in your ditch and it's 6 feet wide for more than like 10 years, that becomes kind of the legal right of way. Or some towns have made ordinances defining the width of the right of way they have access to. So now county roads and state roads, it's different. I'm pretty sure counties own the right of way, but for town roads, which are 2/3 of all roads or more, in New York State, it's this very interesting symbiotic relationship where I own my right of way. And so Keith, that's what I know about it so far. I'm very interested in this topic. It's the symbiotic
thank you.
little edge. You're welcome.
Yeah. Generally misunderstood, I'll tell you.
Yeah, it really is. It's fascinating. All right, want to hear something exciting about it though? This is why I get so excited. It's a private public interface. It's one of the few things where we work symbiotically with the public owns it, but I mean, the private people own it, but we get benefits, and it's managed by the government, right? And so if you think about it, there are edges to parks all around the world where there's all these problems of people poaching on the park. That's a private public interface as well. Nobody has ever studied this. And it's like equal to, if I add up all the right-of-ways in New York State, it's equal to like a 500 square mile park, but it's linear. And it's like, oh my God, nobody's ever studied this. What do you think about your right-of-way? And you can influence water quality if you get involved. To me, it's a fascinating concept. Like, oh my God, how can we have overlooked this? So anyway, that's my fun. All right. Thank you very much, y'all. And great questions. And I wish you the best for all the good work you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You.
Yep. You're welcome.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.